points together and get out of here by 4:30. So,
Is this yours?
hmm?
Is this yours?
Oh yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Okay. I don't know the best way to go about this, but I'm thinking since all of you have a lot of extremely good experience, and can I assume that you sort of went over these? Okay. So why don't we just go around and see what your recommendations would be?
Are we going by question or?
You don't have to take these questions, but you can take these questions. The reason I put these together is they came from these recommendations. So we're kind of, it's sort of, have you done this yet? Or, but you don't have to follow those questions. So.
Do you have an extra copy of that?
Absolutely. Well, I've got this copy.
Well, is it out there?
It was on the back of the
Oh, well,
agenda.
then it should be, I have it there. I have the agenda.
See if it's on the back.
I have the agenda.
No, you didn't get
Yes,
questions.
yes, absolutely.
There you go.
Thank you.
I also don't have it. Are there more copies out there?
It's the one that's in color.
I think the agenda didn't, the copies out there don't
Yeah.
have a back.
Wait,
No, not all.
There's no.
I have an extra copy of the questions. Does everybody have a copy now?
I think so.
Okay.
Lovely.
Tim, you have a copy?
Oh, great. Okay, now I have two if anybody needs an extra.
Okay,
I
so,
think one of my big questions in all of these relates to process and participants, and so it would be helpful to hear from a city's perspective. Since
Exactly,
they
that's
are
it.
yeah.
yeah, so I think if everybody, agrees, I'd like to listen to Leah and Courtney and Malika. Malika. I have a friend named Malika. Malika.
Malika
with-
and Malika.
Yeah. So, Leah, should you start it off?
Yes, thank you. So one thing I'd like to just say first and foremost about the Paris Agreement, just so that everybody's on the same page. The way the Paris Agreement works is that all countries agreed that we should collectively try to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that was the sort of common agreement that was made amongst all nation states under the Paris Agreement. However, the way that the agreement actually operates is that individual countries bring whatever sort of strategies they've got, they're willing to put on the table essentially at the time. So right now, if everybody actually implemented all of the commitments under the Paris Agreement, we would still be on a trajectory for 3 degrees Celsius of warming or more, which is
Compared to what year?
compared to what we well, that seems like
1990 or
in,
something? No.
compared to pre-industrial levels,
Oh, so
so this
long.
is like
Compared
1850s.
to
Yeah. Where we're supposed to be headed is 1.5, right? That's going to be very difficult to do, and that's why we say we're in a climate emergency, because we're almost there. We've already warmed by 1 degree Celsius, and this is like how you start to see all of this intense, more intense storms, water shifting, like all these problems that we're seeing. That's at 1 degree. 1.5 will be worse. 2 degrees now, based on the latest report that's been put out by the IPCC last October, tells us that 2 degrees is a lot worse than 1.5. That's, for a long time been the level which politicians and others have been saying that's the safe level of warming, and we now understand that's not the case. We're going to have 500 million more people suffering from food insecurity, double the number of people suffering from water insecurity, a 99% loss of coral reefs at 2 degrees of warming, and we're on the way for 3 degrees. So happy to share more about that, but I want to get to cities and what we're actually doing. In 2017, when Donald Trump said that he was going to pull the US out of the Paris Agreement, our mayor de Blasio and many others around the country and basically committed to upholding the principles and the goals of the Paris Agreement. And more specifically, we talked about the 1.5 degree warming goal. And that's important because, while no single person, no single city can actually do anything on its own, no country can do anything on its own to make that a reality, we do make efforts to use science-based targets and to try to develop our strategies and our trajectories. So with that in mind, the city put together what I mentioned earlier, which was a 1.5 climate action plan to align the city with Paris. That had a lot of Basically, we prioritize the actions that could reduce the most greenhouse gas emissions the quickest, and we also committed to figuring out what carbon neutrality looks like, or net zero emissions looks like for an entire city. What we know is that to reach 1.5 degrees of warming, the whole world needs to become carbon neutral, or basically not be emitting emissions at all anymore. This is part of what Greta Thunberg talks about. We're not just talking about reducing emissions, we're talking about eliminating emissions. So with that, we prioritize major actions, and just a couple of weeks ago, the city was able to act on some of the first really important major initiatives. We called it the Climate Mobilization Act, and this is what Costa Consultation, the council member, was able to push through as a sponsor. Essentially, this is something that's important because for many cities under these organizations, like what's now called the Global Covenant of Mayors, C40 Cities for Climate Leadership, Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, USDN. There's a lot of networks in which cities and states and other subnational actors are working together. But basically, a lot of cities have put in place targets. Carbon neutrality would be one, 80 by 50, which is an 80% reduction by 2050, 40 by 30, other sort of trajectories over time. But not everybody has figured out how to actually do it and how to fund it and how to just realize it. The legislation that was passed a couple of weeks ago in New York City was the first major step to really make a big difference. So we are now, starting in 2024, all big buildings throughout New York City, all 50,000 of them, will have to perform within certain greenhouse gas emission caps.
All new buildings or all
existing buildings? All large buildings.
All large buildings.
Right. So 2/3 of our emissions in the city come from buildings. So we're talking about electricity, which we think about a lot in terms of climate, like getting to renewable energy. Majority of our emissions actually come from heating. So the combustion of natural gas and fuel oil on site in our buildings, which also is a pollution problem, local pollution. And so yes, this is existing buildings, all large buildings. That's going to be a huge impact, and those targets get more stringent over time, so that we're actually trying to force innovation and force people to act.
Can you relate this to human rights just as you're talking? Because I can just see it in the buildings, how it does relate to human rights.
Absolutely. I mean, so first and foremost, just reducing emissions generally, I think, is a very strong linkage to supporting human rights, because this is a global equity question, right? Like, no question, people are going to be impacted negatively the more we continue to emit. And we know that it's not going to be fair outcomes, right? So people in developing countries are going to be hit harder. We know women and girls are going to be hit harder, certain racial groups are going to be hit harder, indigenous peoples. So there's that sort of global framework about human rights and equity that we have to keep in mind. There's also intergenerational equity at play, so we've talked about that a little bit. But from a local perspective, it's also about creating healthy, safe spaces for people here, right? And so as we are decarbonizing our buildings in this case, and we have lots of policies around transportation and waste and so forth, food systems, we're going to see less cases of asthma, less hospitalizations, less deaths from air quality issues, which we see particular problems around the South Bronx, certain places in Harlem, in central Brooklyn, and we can map sort of where the pollution is actually happening and how those positive benefits will be distributed. We're also talking about job creation. So we talked about growth, but I mean, this is definitely going to be something where, if it's done right, and it's a question of implementation, if it's done right, there are going to be a lot of new opportunities for people that may not otherwise have a chance at a good job with a good pay. We have a lot of training opportunities that are going to be linked up with this. So we have a program called the Green Jobs Corps, which is linking to working with unions, making sure that people in public housing and veterans and all sorts of others have the opportunity to actually come into that pipeline. So all of this is sort of like, it's much bigger than just a climate bill.
Yeah.
There are all these interconnections.
Now these commitments that New York made a couple of weeks ago, are those connected with other cities? or is that just New York City?
This is just New York City for now, but like I said, we work within these networks of cities. We're actually going through a process right now with funding from the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance to develop tools to let other cities actually do this type of legislation, right? So we're working with Seattle, with Washington DC, who just put forward their own.
Okay, so
Similar
could we,
policy.
can we formulate something here for the first bullet point that talks about what New York City has signed on to, the New York City legislation about 2024 and reducing, emissions and so on. The connection with the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance and recommend that the country take this on board somehow. I mean, do you think you can formulate something like that?
I think a general statement would be
Yeah.
to support city climate networks,
Okay.
like C40.
Okay, city climate
UNA,
networks. I mean,
Covenant.
do we want federal legislation, or do we want funding, or do we want,
Certainly funding for cities and states.
funding for
Funding
cities
generally.
and states?
Funding generally.
City climate networks? Yeah,
Funding is the big question for all of this. I mean, who's going to pay for all of the transformation that needs to happen?
right.
Data is another important piece. I heard Ryan mention that. The U.S. government does have some good programs for data collection, but the reason that, and I know Ross spoke about this on Sunday, the reason we were able to develop these policies is because we have such a good resource in the data collection the city's been going through for the last 10 years or so. We have a required benchmarking program for our buildings, so every building every year has to report on their energy use, their water use, their emissions. They're
On
voluntary.
energy and water, or just energy?
Energy, water, and emissions.
Energy, water, and
Usage.
emissions.
So I'm wondering whether a recommendation could be something to the effect of not just to continue to support those efforts, but to leverage in a
Expand, yeah.
knowledge management modality, or even policy guidelines with technical support or learning exchanges between cities that are not in the C40 network, that are somewhere else.
Yeah.
But in line with that, given that New York has progressed as far as it has, I mean, I think an evaluative element of what New York is doing would be important, and not just in terms of, is it effective in
As a
reducing
model or a
emissions?
template or something like
Right,
that,
such
yeah.
that, but also to, I think one important element would be to reveal any unintended consequences, because the other side of the human rights improvement in asthma, lead paint, and other factors that tend to be in inner city areas is also that the people who have the most compliant buildings are the ones who are in new construction in the middle of the city. In other words, there's an income equity issue with respect to housing, and this is true. I mean, this isn't unique to this moment. This is.
But maybe we can focus on the housing issue, because the housing issue impacts people's quality of life, So why don't you see if you can formulate a nice little
Okay.
couple of sentences.
Sure thing.
Okay, did you want to continue, or shall we go around?
Well, I'm just wondering if how we could tie this into national level, and maybe it's people
But
who have
you
a
know-
national level perspective.
Yeah,
Leah, did you wanna continue?
No, I'm thinking like
Leah,
EP,
did you wanna continue?
Yeah, Leah?
EPA perspective.
No, I think I'm definitely open to.
but you'll jump back in.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah. Let's
But-
open it up.
Berenice, do you want to say something first, or well, yeah, let's go to Berenice, because she's done the climate march. Climate walk. Or just thinking in terms of, what kind of recommendations we could make.
Sure. Well,
Yeah.
one really simple one,
Yeah.
which pertains to the last COP, the COP24, and the United Nations role in it, would just be for the United Nations to welcome the recent IPCC report, because it was one of a small group of countries, including Saudi Arabia, Russia, and I think maybe Oman, that refused to welcome the
So
report.
the
meaning that
U.S.
Yes,
should welcome.
the U.S. exactly.
I think you
Um,
said the UN, but we
Oh, I meant the
obviously
U.S. I'm sorry.
should welcome the latest
Yes.
IPCC
That's one thing.
report, yes.
Yeah, another quite broad, and some may think too radical,
Throw it out there.
recommendation would
Throw it
be
out there.
halting all new fossil fuel infrastructure by a certain,
Thank you.
either immediately or by a certain, not
That's my
not
suggestion.
approving at a federal level any new fossil fuel
Okay,
infrastructure projects.
Okay, so shall we give it do we wanna give it a date? Or do we, I mean, immediately is probably
Well, I mean, I guess that's one question, like, are we acknowledging that likely nothing afoot, no plans that New York City has or any place else has are actually gonna be effective? Right, like all of these, like, we're gonna do this by 2040, like, it's too late, that's not gonna work, we'll be at 3 degrees. So, like, are we acknowledging that all of this is actually not effective, or do we want to give suggestions that really and actually will be what is necessary to prevent this from happening?
Well,
Like,
maybe-
because I mean that really
Okay,
changes
but maybe we should start with that statement, that if we don't act now, by whatever it is, 2025 or something, we're gonna be at 1.5 degrees.
Yeah.
What,
I think that makes sense. I mean, this sounds to me like declaring a climate emergency.
yeah,
Right?
Like-
I mean,
like they
and
just
what
did
does
it
that
in-
entail?
Well, except that it has no binding, it doesn't allow them to do
Sure.
anything, it's all ceremonial. I mean, I think we
Well-
had a president that just declared a national emergency for the border wall.
yeah,
Here in America, if the president actually declared a national emergency, that would actually be effective and binding, because it would then mobilize money and
Right.
and like action
Right. If
to
it
do
worked,
it, and
yeah.
there would be a way to get things done, rather than like going through Congress, and which won't work because none of us own our senators or Congress people,
So, if we make these statements that we should halt all new fossil fuel infrastructure by 2025 or whatever it is, they will be, this will be brought up to them next year, and they will either support or note, but they'll have to at least listen.
Like, so I think just as we talk about fossil fuel infrastructure, these pipelines and things that are built have lifetimes of like half a century, right? So the pipeline that I live along is
It was
50 years old, and they just built a massive new one under a nuclear power plant that then will work for another 50 years. And so we're dumping billions and
And we
billions
thought
and
it was
billions
stopped,
of dollars into like infrastructure that is going to kill us,
Yeah.
and not into renewable energy.
Yeah,
So the stopping the building, it's like the shovel in the ground, you should put it down and stop right now.
But there has to be, so I agree with what you're saying, and like we cannot invest in new fossil fuel infrastructure for exactly that reason. I mean, the lifespan is forever. But there needs to also be funding for the alternative, right? You can't just say you can't have energy, good luck. Like, there has to
But
be
we
the
are,
support.
one, not taxing these companies that are doing this, and two, giving subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. So the funding
Yeah,
question,
so-
I think, is just like make them pay their taxes and stop giving them our free tax
George-
dollars.
So a way to
George
put that
has-
would be to say shift subsidies from fossil fuels
To
to
renewables.
renewables.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I have a question actually. Is it acceptable for recommendations to pertain to specific pieces of policy or I'm thinking about the passage and implementation of the Green New Deal, for example. Like that's something that I would like to recommend. Yeah.
Okay, I'm in favor of the Green New Deal. We have to relate it to human rights. So when
Right.
when we're saying shift subsidies from fossil fuels to renewables in order to,
Oh, okay. Sure.
So one of the things that we were talking, I wrote in my notes was eliminate single-use plastic. But also when you eliminate single-use plastic, also when you're doing the recycling of existing plastic, making sure that recyclables are affordable. So a lot of times when you have recycled shoes that are trendy or recycled clothing that's trendy, it's not affordable to the masses.
make sure that recycling
like the byproducts of what you reuse it for, that is affordable to the masses. So if it's being recycled, that is actually going to be used. And then when you're eliminating the single-use plastic for the population that might be hurt by the charge that's asserted with it, how are they going to be funded to be able to use alternative measures? And then also a lot of times when you're doing education,
Are you writing these down?
I wrote it down already. And then a lot of time when you're having workshops or meetings and so forth, you're talking to people who already agree with you. So making sure that when you're doing these kind of things that you have a targeted audience and that the audience is ranging in ages, and then that how are you going to address it? So now when you're having a plant-based diet, for instance, the impact of having a plant-based diet then reduces the harm to the land.
Right.
So then therefore have funding and legislation at the city, state, and federal level where it can be implemented in childhood centers, where it can be implemented in hospitals, where it can be implemented in government offices. So then that way it's nationwide, but then also tying it into other initiatives that are global. And then as you spoke to, making sure that you have benchmarks and also to understand that there is the combination between the two so you can see it. So when you're talking to the general public, they're understanding what you're saying. So you're not saying the deal for the UN 2030 goals. Well, we know what that means, but when you're talking outside of the room to people who don't know that, what can I do on a daily basis to be helpful to this? So on a daily basis, you can have your reusable water bottles. And at the Global Summit, they were giving away those water bottles, and you walked away with something that one spoke to some of the city policies that are being initiated, and then what you can do on a local level.
Well, I hope you can write those down. I mean,
did.
the one on the plant, the one on the plant-based diet is so good because it's directly affecting human rights, and it directly helps adapt to climate change and so on. So yeah, that's the kind of thing we want.
Okay, so I can come back to this question about not only buildings but also transportation, which are two of the major.
That's good.
So we need to develop strategies to electrify everything.
Yeah.
That's buildings and that's vehicles or trains or whatever it's got to be, because that's the way you tap into
But you see,
renewable
that's a
power.
good way to put it. Develop strategies to that's
electrify
good.
everything, and then you can fund specifically that transformation in buildings and transportation for LMI communities, right? Because this then low and medium income. So that not only mitigates climate change, but also improves air quality and health outcomes, both on the transit and
so
the building
that's the way
side.
it should be formulated, right? And I was at a workshop in Haverstraw yesterday, and they were talking about these geothermal systems, and George, you probably know that, where you can go around to all the buildings and send, sort of a loop of water that can heat and
Mercy
cool.
College has that.
Which one?
Mercy.
Mercy College.
That's what my house runs.
But, Aaliyah, if you know about that, because that would be very good for New York City, I would think.
So in New York City, the plan is geothermal is definitely an option for some places, but because of
The density.
yes, and how we have some physical constraints, we're actually looking to air source heat pumps, which are similar. Geothermal systems are also heat pumps, they're just served by
Heat
water.
pumps,
So there was just an article in the Times today about how we need to electrify everything, and that's sort of like the motto of our office. But yes, moving away from natural gas, moving away from fuel oil, and towards either geothermal or air source heat pumps to heat and cool
that's
spaces.
the one.
And then you can tap into wind, solar.
So I think these are all great ideas because they're practical. It's not just pie in the sky. We could actually do these things.
Well, we're only getting somewhere if we get the electricity off of renewables.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, if all you're doing is gonna get the electricity from
Well,
fossil
our earlier one was
There's
shift
no
all
more
subsidies
fossil
from
fuels,
fossil fuels to renewables.
Right.
And
Okay.
renewables including
I
storage.
think we can get a progression of things, but start with the statement about how we're rapidly moving to the 1.5, and we've got to act right now.
Yep.
And then the one about reducing, shifting subsidies over to to renewables. I got a big subsidy when I got solar on my roof. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. In Peekskill, we did solarize.
Yeah.
But our city has a high. It's a very black and brown city. We have a high percentage of people living in substandard housing and living in poverty. So there's not money in those households to put solar panels on, or they are renters. So that's kind of what prompted us to do community choice aggregation, where as an entire city we just all get our power, because you can't, like, it's like some of these solutions, like solar panels on your roof, are solutions for wealthy people,
Right.
not for.
But do you have an array of solar panels in the?
So we have a community solar installation nearby. And then we did do solarize, which was for homeowners to put solar on their roofs, and that was, they could get large subsidies, and because the whole city was doing it at once, it was much cheaper, things like that. But then we did pass community choice aggregation, where we just buy into Westchester Power, and like all the communities that are part of it are all on a contract with an energy provider that is low impact hydro.
Okay, just a second. Tim wants to say something.
Well, I think we're arriving at some of the general principles as well as the operational ones.
Yeah.
If you want some linkage to that, a number of biologists and sociologists sat down with steady state economics people and drew up a list of the ecological 10 commandments. In other words, what we ought to be aiming for as general principles. If you're interested in it, it's accessible online, and you can use it as a way to think about things. It's called Ethical Principles for Smart Growth. This was back when smart growth was a big thing. And the subtitle of it is Steps Towards an Ecological 10 Commandments. So you can just look at them and use them, designed within the possible. In other words, reinsert the human enterprise within Earth's biogeochemical cycling, maintaining throughput solar energy. Substitute the consumption of non-renewables with renewables. Reduce the consumption of renewables to at or below the level of their renewal. Otherwise, you're taking a renewable and making it into a non-renewable. So these are if you go down
leave them on the board.
you can all take it home. It's a public PDF file, but it goes right down to including, expose, denounce, condemn, and seek to punish those who consistently and intentionally violate the precepts of responsible eco-citizenry, including those who present themselves as respectable public leaders.
But I think that's a very important point. I would want to just chime in one more time, George, that having now been working on something where the focus on punitive law rather than a human rights approach becomes so essential, that will punish the people who intentionally violate, just as it's described there. It may also punish the people who do not have the choice to not violate. And so I think that when we make our statement, we need to include that kind of a aggregating community support solution with explicit language, because we don't want to, in the FGM work, literally efforts to stop FGM have become rights violation sources. They're creating new rights violations because people are put in a non-choice situation. That's a little bit different from
so ours is a non-choice, like you're automatically signed up for it, you have to opt out, but it's the rate that we locked in is actually lower than Con Edison's rate from 2015. So we're not forcing low-income families to pay extra for green because a bunch of rich white people want renewable energy.
Rate.
So I don't know what you would call those mitigation.
Or basically make sure the burden is not unduly put upon low income.
And I just want to add something else here, because I was at that meeting in Haverstraw, and my thing was reducing stormwater, the stormwater that goes into the sewerage system. And so the whole thing about green roofs and rain gardens, I'm sure Berenice knows a lot about it. Just swales and just getting rainwater back into the earth, and rain barrels and cisterns and all those things. So I'd like to put something in there about conserving water and not allowing stormwater to go into the sewerage system, because that's when you have the overflows and it goes into the Hudson River.
That was also before why I was saying education and the targeted population, because if you do those things in the community and in the schools,
And if they
the
don't buy
children,
in,
right, the children will get excited about it, the parents can have the rain barrels at their homes, and then they can start the
That's right.
gardens, and it all ties in together. Or even at the institutions I was talking about before, if you have those things, they can have their gardens at those institutions as well. So there's, it's
even the
all
green
tied
roofs
together.
can be on the schools, yeah,
Right, so it can,
absolutely.
like I said, it can be part of education and curriculum and your targeted
Yeah.
audience.
Can composting be added?
Tie with the curriculum.
It's hard in New York City.
Green infrastructure. So, did you want to add something, Courtney? Because you were sort of in the middle
Yeah,
of a
so-
statement, I think.
I think, well, in terms, so we're focusing, it sounds like we're focusing a lot on what cities can do, like, or non-national government, federal government things can
But
do.
we,
That's national.
well, what we would like the the federal government to support these
I think they should do
initiatives.
this. I
Well,
mean,
yeah, but we don't, and none of us here think that this administration will
We'll do it.
sure, but the whole point of this is to say what should
Right, but I
happen.
thought the question was, what do cities, US states, cities and organizations, so like question 2 was not the federal government, it was like what can other entities do? And I think, so my city is an environmental justice city, we are chock full of polluting infrastructure, water, like sewage treatment, we have a wheelabrator plant that burns the entirety of Westchester County's garbage, so whatever you don't recycle comes to Peekskill, and the people in my city get to breathe it. And then on top,
It has a big incinerator.
yeah,
It's
they call it
waste-
renewable.
It's waste energy.
Yep.
It's something that I've fought against for years, never mind.
And you want to use the waste energy to treat wastewater, right? But we're just letting it go into the air. No, the waste energy from this isn't being used.
It generates power
It does. Okay.
for Westchester
It's not
County,
generating
but
power.
it's all of our trash, and it also
And you
makes,
get all of our recycling.
So Westchester already has like really not great air quality. We have like there's a couple weeks ago a study came out from Texas A&M University, like so you can quantify like how many people in your community are dying from air pollution, and we have hundreds and like 800 something people per year dying, like that they would attribute to the air pollution
And
there.
how many people do you have in Peekskill?
We have about 20,000 people, and as I said, black and brown people,
Yeah.
poor people. We also, and we have tons of industry that pollutes and all these things. We have the nuclear power plant that people say doesn't pollute or it's green or whatever, but there's leaking radioactivity and
Is that
stuff.
Indian Point?
Yeah.
So Indian Point is like 1 mile from my house, and then on top of that, we
got
got
these
the gas
pipelines.
pipeline. Now, even if my city didn't want it, Rockland County, Westchester County, Putnam County
None of
didn't
us
want
wanted
it.
Yeah.
None of the local municipalities wanted it.
And they
They had
did it
no
anyway.
say because it's the Natural Gas Act, and there's federal laws that basically override the rights of communities to protect their residents.
Well, we should say something
So
about
that's-
that.
Right, so that's why I'm thinking like
Yeah.
if we're like we were thinking of ways like what can we do in end run around the feds to get states to do it, but New York State has powers delegated by the EPA, but Governor Cuomo still approved this pipeline project. So he banned fracking, but frontline communities and black and brown communities like mine are still dealing with all the air quality and health impacts that come from fracked gas infrastructure because he allows these to be built.
Yeah.
We just had the Con Edison moratorium where they said no more natural gas hookups. They finally come and Cuomo gave $250 million for like renewable heat solutions, and we're all happy. And then just last week, Con Edison announced that the Tennessee gas pipeline is gonna up its delivery to Westchester. What community does that go into? Mount Vernon. Who lives there? Poor black people. So over and over again, we have communities that want to protect themselves that are not able to because
And this is environmental justice.
this
we're
is most
talking about.
definitely
yeah.
like my community has high rates of asthma, low birth weight, hospitalizations for cardiovascular disease. So like we are already feeling
On the-
the health impacts of
Yeah.
these things.
Yeah.
I think, I'm wondering if a way to speak to that might be, because it does become a not in my backyard kind of question, but that the aggregation of engagement, because we've talked about cities informing
Yeah.
national, something that just recognizes that, you need to have a bigger picture to recognize that certain problems go to only certain communities.
So that was what I was gonna say when you're talking about that's really toxic release inventory sites you're talking about. So it doesn't matter what the toxic release inventory is, it most generally across nation affects, and not only nation, globally affects Black and brown communities. And generally you see the policy that was put in place prior, which is allowed it. So there's a precursor to why this occurs. It's not like it's arbitrary.
Toxic release inventory.
Toxic
TRI,
release.
it's a
Yeah.
national index, in fact,
Exactly.
again, which this administration is trying to remove
Yeah.
from the record. and
Regulations.
Put blocks on access to it.
We'll be
It used to be
required this year to
something
report that.
There's a lot of
you used to be
reports.
able to get it.
It's like, I don't know if we need something along the lines of like allowing, like we need some way to empower
Yeah.
frontline communities to
Well,
be
this is-
able to push back against this stuff.
To have accountability.
Number 8 in the eco-justice thing is entitle and empower local communities to manage their resources sustainably.
Well, even some of these things, they're not my resource. It's Westchester's garbage that comes to my city.
Yeah.
It's
Manage
Pennsylvania's fracked gas that
their
comes to my city. So it's not my resource.
Do you
It's-
do you get the
they're
bomb trains as well? Or
No, those
they're
are across the river from
Yeah,
us.
they're over in Haverstraw. Yeah.
But I think that one of the dynamics here is that there are people who don't want those, and there are also people who make money over processing them. They're not necessarily investing the money in those communities. And I know that one of the issues with like Indian Point most recently was that the school system in whatever town it is.
It's my school system, Hendrick
Okay,
Hudson
my
School
son was about
District.
to go play you guys in baseball. That was a big issue about those resources. So those are ways that they sort of try and mitigate, but it's not ways that address the environmental impact.
Right. So like the elementary school that's closest to the nuclear power plant, that's 400 feet from the gas pipeline, is the one of the 3 elementary schools in the district that has the most Black and brown kids, the most kids on free school lunch.
maybe
So it
it's
wasn't going next to the
the
elementary school for the white
There was,
kids.
we had so many protests against that damn pipeline.
Governor
And all my
Cuomo,
friends went to jail.
Governor Cuomo took several $1 million from them.
I'm wondering if
So-
you
And they
could
just go ahead
include
with it anyway.
that, I mean, there are accountability questions. There's also, some of this is gonna take a long time to get out of the places where it's aggregated. That mitigation or,
I mean, I think when we get into mitigation,
compensation strategies need to be more than giving money to the school system. That's what I'm trying to
well,
get at.
I
They
mean,
need to
but like, how do you?
address the
It's like I know 800 people in your community are gonna die from air pollution. Here's some money, or here's an after-school program. Like, how do you mitigate?
Right.
No, but I'm just saying that it's not mitigation, it needs to be accountability with respect to the environmental impact of what they're doing. In other words, the
Right.
investments that they're
I mean,
making
I would
need
say,
to go
like,
beyond school.
The overturning the Natural Gas Act, or like, would be the thing that would have saved my community and would have saved many other communities.
When was that enacted?
The 30s.
It was reinforced by Bush and Cheney.
By Cheney, yeah, in
Cheney in
Halliburton.
particular, yeah.
The 1930s.
Yeah.
The 1930s.
And it gives federal control. I think it also then
We are
relates
sitting in the
to,
Ford Foundation, I just
Yeah.
want to remind you.
that's all right, that,